Those two books are absolutely wonderful. They should be required reading for anyone who talks about emigration without having emigrated themselves, without having experienced that. It is not the same. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today, two books on the menu, two books that I think all politicians in all countries should read when it comes to this very debated problem of immigration or emigration. Eva Hoffman, very famous Lost in Translation from 1989, and Milan Kundera's Ignorance from 2000. Now, of course, don't forget to comment on your favorite Kundera, perhaps. He wrote quite a few novels and short stories, and of course, whether you read Eva Hoffman's wonderful memoir and what you thought of it. Now, Kundera died, unfortunately, in 2023, and you probably know the story of this immense author of the 20th century, born in the Czech Republic, what was of course not yet the Czech Republic before the separation. And he wrote first in Czech, and then he went into exile to France for political reasons, obviously. And he started reading and writing essentially in French, and for the rest of his life he only wrote in French and never really went back to the Czech Republic as a sign of protest, basically. Eva Hoffman's trajectory is rather different. She was born in Poland, and also for her political reasons, she had to leave that country when she was a tiny teenager, really, and she emigrated to Canada, and then she went on to study in America, in the United States of America, where she got a PhD in English literature. So on one hand, a professor of literature, somebody who studied the thing, and who also wrote other books than just Lost in Translation. On the other hand, an immense author, one of the most important authors, writers of the 20th century, certainly, Milan Kundera, who himself, of course, penned quite a few novels. You must, of course, have heard of his most famous one. It was also made into a very famous movie, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and that's from 1984. The Joke, of course, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, Life is Elsewhere, one of those that launched him on the world scene. And a favorite of mine, really, a non-fiction, The Art of the Novel from 1986. Wonderful little book on basically writing from the point of view of a writer. And it's always interesting to know what writers actually try to achieve. And if you do that a little bit, you realize, of course, that not one of them wants to achieve the same thing as the other one. But that's always interesting to sort of think about literature from a point of view of one creating it. Now, why are those books not only interesting in themselves, but also very enriching when put together? It's quite simply because they deal with, or they touch upon, the topic of emigration and what emigration does to somebody's identity and soul in some ways, of course. Emigration is, both in those cases, as I said, was a politically motivated move. They simply had to leave the country they were originated from. And as you know, obviously, that's typically why people emigrate. Usually, unless you have a very good job, people don't emigrate, don't leave the country for good, just because they feel like it. There's always a reason, and it might be, of course, political, financial, societal. But exile is never really looked for. And that's something that to keep in mind when you see migrants around you, of course, is that essentially they may be very grateful to be welcome in your country, but they didn't leave their country because they wanted to, and they would rather, of course, be there with their family and friends and the culture they come from, than separate themselves from everything they know. So these two novels, these two books, one a novel, Ignorance, and the other one a memoir, Lost in Translation, these two books approach the question of basically the pain of exile and the pain of emigration. And this pain, of course, is very difficult probably to understand for somebody who did not leave their country for any significant time. And we're talking years here, we're talking decades in both their cases. That pain might be very difficult to understand, but it is crucially at the heart of those two books. And that pain is not a physical pain, obviously. Most of the time it isn't. It is, of course, a psychological, mental pain. The pain not only of leaving behind what you know and what you had and everything that gave meaning in a way to your life up until the moment you leave, but also the pain of being in the new place and all the impressions you get from being there, all the clashes that you get from being there, all the things you do not understand, all the things that are simply like a big wedge between you and integration. Now, of course, you've all heard of culture shock. That shock you get when you move to a new country and you realize that the most difficult things to integrate are not the big things. It's the small, everyday things that you never really thought about before. The type of bread perhaps you eat or grew up eating, the type of food you grew up eating in general, the way one sits at table, the way one pays at the shop, the way one occupies oneself in a weekend. All those things are eminently cultural. And because they are so natural, of course, wherever we come from, we tend to think that they are indeed natural and exactly alike for everyone. And that's a culture shock, realizing that what you are used to, what you view as completely natural, is obviously a social construction. And in that sense, that's a culture shock. And when you know that you will not go back to what you know, what molded you in the beginning, then of course that pain is accentuated. And those two books are beautiful about that. They make it very, very clear what stands between the desire to belong and belonging. And it is not the people in the new place where you migrate to that are the obstacle. Typically, it's a minority which is an obstacle. It is really, again, those cultural, invisible things to ourselves in our own culture, which certainly take on a gigantic, sort of ever-present space in your life, and it can be very difficult to deal with. I left my own country more than 20 years ago now to move to the Netherlands, and there are still things that I find weird, knowing full well that they are not weird, they're just Dutch. But they're not the way I grew up with, and I stayed more than 20 years in France. I grew up in France, and therefore those differences sometimes can be annoying, and sometimes they can create real pain. I did not leave for political reasons. I am entirely free to go back if I want to, and that was certainly not the case of either Kundera or Hoffman, of course. So this pain, of course, is strongly related to what they both look for, search, and yearn for in many ways, desire more than anything in some ways, and that is full sort of integration. But full integration then reminds us that integration is related, of course, to a sense of identity that you have or that you share, let's say, with those around you. But when you migrate to a new country, the people around you do not share that sense of identity that you thought was self-evident growing up with your friends and your family and your acquaintances. That was what identity was. And now suddenly you realize that identity may be construed, may be understood, may be conceptualized in a very different way. And that, of course, leads immediately both Eva Hoffman in Lost in Translation and Milan Kundera in Ignorance. It leads both of them to ask themselves essential questions about their own identity. That is, Eva Hoffman, for example, being of Poland, Polish extraction, or Polish birth really. She spent 13, 14 years of her life, the first 14 years of her life in Poland. Eva Hoffman, of course, is now facing the question of, okay, what does it actually mean to be me? Because I thought that it was clear who I was in the environment in which I grew up. But now it seems that people see me differently. People do not understand what others, Polish people, would immediately understand, being, of course, acquainted with the culture. Whereas in Canada and later in America, she realizes that this crucial bit of information about what molded her in the beginning, that crucial bit of information is obviously missing in different countries, and therefore people do not see her as she always thought she was. They do not see her as the person she always thought she was. They see her as somebody that she doesn't always recognize. And that is, of course, exactly what is also happening to the narrator of Ignorance, the Kundera's novel, because he, for different reasons, he finds himself in Danish, for example, in Denmark, and between, say, Paris, Denmark, and the idea of the Czech Republic, the idea of the country of birth, these three forces really operate on the identity of the narrator in such a way that it makes it very, very difficult to know, well, who you are, basically. You thought you knew, but now it's not that clear anymore. Now, where both of those books are extremely interesting as well is on the linguistic aspect, that is language. What role does language play in questions of migration and search for identity? Now, we all know, of course, that language carries identity, carries culture, and it's not always clear to us to what extent that is true. And of course, we don't need to go back to the Sapir and Whorf hypothesis of only being able to see what your grammar and vocabulary give you access to. Nevertheless, it's very clear in both Eva Hoffman's Lost in Translation and Kundera's Ignorance that language does play a great role in constructing the world in which your identity developed and blossomed. And that therefore the words that you were used to, Polish in the case of Hoffman, and Czech, let's say, in the case of Kundera, the language you were used to was the language you used to describe reality. But now you have a new tool, a new language, and there is not always a one-to-one equivalence, a one-to-one match between a way to describe reality in Polish and a way to describe reality in English. Sometimes, as Eva Hoffman reflects on many times, there are no equivalents in English, and perhaps, in fact, there are no equivalents in Polish. In other words, she's trying to sort of, let's say, translate an English word for herself or integrate it in her own identity, and she might find that very, very difficult because, in fact, the very concept denoted by the English word, for example, doesn't fit well in Polish culture. And of course, conversely, many concepts in the Polish language, in the Polish culture, do not translate well or at all in English, as Wierzbicka, the linguist, showed. I cannot remember the name of the book, but I'm sure I'll be able to put it somewhere, where she examined the word friend, and there's one word in English basically, and there's like 5, I think, in Polish and 6 in Russian, or 4 and 5, I can't remember. In other words, there are simply things that do not translate. Now, both of them are absolutely wonderful about this because they don't moan about things, they don't whine all the time, do not expect misery type of stuff. That's not the case at all. But it's full of questions, it's full of interrogations about what it is to move away, what it is to have to become somebody new. Do you have to become somebody new? Do you become somebody new because you have no choice, because it is required of you? By whom? What kind of pressures are there for a migrant to change as a person? And language in here, of course, is, as anybody who's lived abroad knows, both an incredibly difficult obstacle and, of course, a great liberating tool once you can manipulate it. Let me read you just a couple of lines and I'll put it on the screen. I decided to tell a joke myself, says Eva Hoffman. I launched into an uncertain translation of some anecdote I had heard my father tell in Polish. But as I hear my choked up voice straining to assert itself, as I hear myself missing every beat and rhythm that would say funny and punchline, I feel a hot flush of embarrassment. Oh, the humiliation, the misery of failing to amuse. The incident is as rankling to my amour-propre as being told I am graceless or ugly. And indeed, anybody who has dealt with those situations of trying to make a joke in a second, third, fourth language, whatever, of the joke falling flat completely, not because the joke in itself is bad, but perhaps because the joke is too cultural or the translation simply doesn't work. The joke very often is in the telling, in the rhythm, in the words that are used, and it may be impossible to translate it. Of course, it works both ways. How many times have I sat at a table hearing people trading jokes in Dutch, and in the beginning I just didn't understand anything, and it's embarrassing to say the least, and really annoying as well, of course. And that's a line that Kundera echoes. Kundera says, speaking Danish, the narrator in Denmark, with other people, he was always conscious of choosing his words, constructing a sentence, watching his accent. It seemed to him that when Danes talked, they were running nimbly, while he was trudging along behind, lugging a 20-kilo load. And again, anybody who had to migrate, or who migrated, knows exactly what Kundera means here, is that indeed in the beginning it's lugging a 20-kilo load whenever you're trying to make a sentence, whereas you hear people around you and they seem to fly and be graceful and light with the exact same tool. So the role of language here is seen both in a sort of let's say world-defining semantic role, that is, can you affix the same words to the same meanings? Do you have the same meanings across languages? And it is also, of course, a source of solace, perhaps, sometimes, even though Eva Hoffman didn't really speak Polish after a few years and never really had occasion to use it, and certainly when she moved to the States. But again, any migrant will know the sort of the comfort that you get from slipping back into your native language. It's like putting on old, slippers, and the sense of comfort, of weight off your shoulder, because you can say what you want to say in a sort of non-thinking way. It's such a wonderful relief when you've been lugging this 20-kilo load every minute of the day during the year. Now, of course, finally, those two books deal with the idea of returning home. And that's certainly true of Kundera, who, again, even though he was invited later on when the wall fell and when, let's say, East Germany and therefore the old communist bloc fell apart, he was invited to go back to the Czech Republic many times, but he systematically refused. And he continued to write in French. In fact, for many years, he refused that his books be translated in a Czech language. Still, the idea of any migrant is always there somewhere, and that is, one, do I want to go home? And immediately the second question is, where is home? What is home? When, as a teenager, you move countries, like Eva Hoffman did in Lost in Translation, the situation is even different from the one that Kundera was finding himself in, because Kundera was already, let's say, a man, as it were. He wasn't a 13, 14-year-old Polish girl. He was already active in life and in politics. He was a grown man. Eva Hoffman makes it very clear that this idea of home becomes very quickly a sort of both a present question and a question that becomes increasingly impossible to answer. Because she realizes also that what was home when she was 5 or 10 or 12, well, she's not the same person anymore. And it's not only the language that she uses, which is different, she speaks in English, but it's also that she has grown and she has become a new person, as we all do when, of course, we leave a teenagehood behind. In other words, why call home what is essentially like the memory of our own house when we were 5 is? If I remember where I grew up, I cannot go back there. I could call that home, but it's a feeling, it's a moment of growing in a life, of course. For Kundera, it's difficult, home, because home is there. He could go back. Maybe he should go back. But he has severed himself from that home, from those years and those decades away from the Czech Republic. In other words, is there a home? Becomes the question for Kundera. What is a home? Is it only the memory of the place you grew up in? Is it only the place you grew up in? But as anybody knows who grew up in one place, then went to another place to grow and work, and then went back to their original hometown, the hometown changes while you're away. And when you come back, well, yes, you recognize kind of everything, but you also don't. And then the people you used to know are not there anymore, etc., etc., etc. So what is that concept of home, and is it ever possible to have a home? Those two books are absolutely wonderful. They should be required reading for anyone who talks about emigration without having emigrated themselves, without having experienced that. It is not the same to go for 3 or 6 months abroad to study or live or whatever, and to leave the place for good. It is not the same to spend a year on an Erasmus program and spending 10, 15, 20 years with no hope of being able to return. Those two things are really different. And I wish that all those people talking about migration and emigration all the time, very often for political gains, of course, I wish those people would read those two wonderful, absolutely beautifully written books, which really would give them a glimpse of what it is to migrate, remembering that no, it's not all fun and games. No, you don't migrate because you want to grab somebody else's money. You leave so much behind. You break so much inside of yourself. You come to such questions about your own identity and who you are that it's a price that can be very high. And certainly when you have not made that choice yourself, when you were forced to migrate, that price, of course, is even higher. So I can only recommend that you go out and buy those two wonderful books. Thank you for watching. Thank you eventually for perhaps commenting, liking, and sharing this video. Bye-bye.